I did it. What did I do? Um, I finally finished this monster of a book called A Little Life. It sits at what 814 pages long. Um, this book is to begin with, this book is a absolute you should not read if you have PTSD. But if you are, I think, aspiring to be a life coach, or if you are aspiring to be someone who works in the mental health field, especially with people who have trauma, it is, I think, a must read. So it's a very polar book from the perspective, and I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of people quit this book halfway. Number one, because of its sheer volume. 814 pages is not a small amount to read, but this book is hard to read. This book is not just, a bunch of trigger warnings. This book itself is a traumatic experience to read. Um there were moments where I felt just so completely horrible, like I couldn't do anything. I just had to lay the book down and I just had to stop to try to digest the things that happened in this book. And part of this is, I think, the author is a little bit sadistic. um so the author would just explain things in such a wonderful detail about like how life is going, and it's about four group of four friends, and it would talk about how one friend has these wonderful interactions with another friend, but at the same time friend number three is feeling all these things, but then this is all being unfolded as they're together at a Chinese restaurant like eating something. And the book is really like, it's so good at capturing those moments, and then out of the blue something fucking terrible happens, and it just gets worse. And I'm really not exaggerating when I just say it just keeps getting worse. The book just gets consistently horrible. So I think it like around the mid mark, there's no redeeming quality about it. It just keeps on being worse. And I think if you find other reviews for this book, you'll see that this is more or less the sentiment about this book. But why am I reviewing this in the first place? Well, I have a few things I want to specifically say about this book. But before each of the 3 points that I'm gonna make, I think the meaning of this book is that even when your life is full of torment, and even when your life is full of trauma, and even when your life is so like inexplicably cruel to you, and you have no reason to try to make your life work. You have no reason to literally stay alive. You have no reason to eat. And every activity that consists every activity that comprises living, you see a no reason to. Like, you might think that's a really shitty and horrible life, but you have to understand that still is life. And maybe that's why it's called A Little Life. The book is fucking huge, and the torment of the main characters is huge, but it's a little life in one perspective. Because from the perspective of everything that happens in the world, this is still like a monumentally big life, but at the same time, it's a little life. So no matter what kind of life you're living, you have to understand that it's a perspective issue. And you can believe that your life is meaningless, but there are ways that when your life is meaningful. You can believe your life is meaningful, but there are ways to view it as meaningless. But when you get so absorbed into one perspective, which again, the book completely justifies, it just turns you blind to that crucial fact of life. And So there's two waves of certainty I talk about, right? And for example, when I say a man can go to moon, and I wouldn't believe it if I didn't know better, right? I wouldn't believe that it's possible to go to that sky circle over there. But then I would read about it, right? Like how about Apollo and Neil Armstrong and the others, and I'd be like, whoa, I guess that is possible. But then I still don't believe it for me. And then turns out, I have a friend who works at NASA, and then he starts telling me, like, if I don't talk about this with him, but like, if my friend keeps telling me about how it's totally possible, like the technology behind it, and I'm an engineer too, right? So like, I get to understand the actual system in which it is possible to get to the moon and all the things that the astronauts do. Like, the more you do, the more he does that, the more I realize that this is also possible for me. Now, this happens with everything in life, you know? Jujitsu, like I trained jujitsu and then I went to competitions, but like I didn't believe, like, oh, I guess some people compete in jujitsu, but then I never thought it would be me. And then I saw all my gym mates do it, and then whoa, like, and people ask me, Billy, are you gonna do it? No, I'm not gonna do that. Like, why would I? That's not for me. And then they would say, like, it totally is if you want to. And then it hits me, right? I look at my gym mates and they're all going, and I'm like, huh, maybe it is for me too, right? So when you realize that it is like theoretically possible, that's the first wave of certainty. And then when you realize that it is possible for you too, that's the second wave of certainty. So the protagonist of this book is basically always encountered with the first wave of certainty of a happy and not life that is free of suffering. But nobody, because presumably, like, nobody really like is qualified to give this kind of advice to the protagonist of the book. Nobody convinces him of the second wave of certainty that that life is for him too. And I want you to remember that. I know you're not gonna read this book. It's very unlikely that you're gonna read this book, but I want you to remember that about yourself. Like, no matter what kind of a life you want, it happens in two waves of certainty. And as long as you cannot get past the second wave of certainty, you will continue believing that certain types of life is forever restricted from you. And that's not a bad thing. I have lots of things like that too. So, but I just want you to understand whatever life you want to intentionally lead yourself towards, there's always going to be that second wave of realization and integration into your belief system that this is something that is possible for me. Not for anybody else, not for all the other people, but for me. Okay, with that, there are three specific points I want to discuss in this book. Number one is the protagonist has a limp. And not only a limp, but like he is dependent on wheelchairs and then later on gets an amputation and such. So there's lots of mobility issues and everything, but it is near the end of the book that the protagonist recognizes and actually comes to terms with the fact that he is disabled. And I think this is more of a character analysis, but I think it's a bit of a social commentary on how we allow so many different perspectives and so many like really like crazy things to happen to our mind, and we do engage in a lot of self-harm, and we engage in so many different destructive behaviors for ourselves, and at the same time like we don't want to cross the line of being called a disabled person. And that kind of ableism that's so deeply ingrained in society, like I would rather be called like a crazy person who has all these excuses than be a disabled person. That I think is really telling of our whole world's perspective on being disabled, and how toxic ableism is in the world. So that when people sometimes come across these really life altering situations where amputations are needed, or like they need to have their sights significantly altered, or like, they need life support for something, or they need synthetic organs, or artificial pumps or whatever. then there's so much shame in not being a proper human being. And through this, like around 700 pages later, the character who is clearly disabled from the first part of the book gets to acknowledge that he is disabled is really telling of how we view the disabled, whether it be mentally or the physically. So I thought that was an interesting point of the book. The second point I want to make is slightly related to the overall premise that I started out with. But now I've seen criticisms about not criticism. I've seen discussions about this book where they talk about no amount of love is enough for this person. People surrounding the main character give him so much like copious amounts of love, like almost extravagant amounts of love. But now the perception is that that's not enough of a love to like change him and completely accept and fundamentally make him feel he is loved. I think this isn't a amount of love problem, but it's the amount of love that you allow for yourself. People can give me lots of gifts and they can give me many things, but if I don't accept them, then I can be really I don't have to take them. And so one person can give me love all my life, and it could be my wife, and I would be happy without anybody else's love. That's okay. That's a choice I can make, right? And that's one person's love. But if on the other end of the spectrum, you have this character who gets absolutely admired and loved for everything that he does, everything that he is today, but his heart isn't open to accept it. He can't see himself as someone who can be loved. But why I'm reiterating this is a powerful tool that you can wield once you understand the mechanics of it. This also tells you that you can be criticized. People can hate you and people can try to put you down. People can try to deny you. But as long as you don't accept that, as long as you don't let yourself be hurt by what other people think of you, you're effectively immune from all of this. And this book takes the opposite direction to the extreme. And what I'm offering to you is that the same concept can apply in the opposite direction. People can think whatever of you, especially when you're trying to make something out of yourself, especially when you're trying to change your ways into becoming a new type of person that you want to be. Now, when you make those types of changes, your world will rebel against you because your world is more or less used to being you in this certain kind of way, fulfilling a certain kind of role, and they will try to keep you in its place. But as long as you don't accept that, you can have your way in your life. So that's the second point I want to talk about this book. Now, the third one is this is a little bit difficult to say, but when you focus so much on how you are the victim, it really makes you blind to how you can be the abuser. And this is not just for abuse things. When you solely focus on how unlucky you are in your life, it makes you blind to all the privilege and all the things that you lucked into in your life. When you only care about the type of love that you want but you don't receive, for example, you want to be romantically loved, but you have no boyfriend, you have no girlfriend, you have no one who loves you in the way you want, it turns you blind to all the people who love you in other different ways. And why this is so important, especially for this book, is the protagonist endured so many different types of abuse. So, I'm gonna put an age restriction on this, and now you can stop the video here. I basically made my point. But basically, orphaned from the get-go. They found him in front of a monastery, wrapped up. And now they raise him in the monastery, and then in the monastery they rape him and physically abuse him. And one of the brothers in the monastery says, "You should run away with me," and forms an emotional bond. Runs away together, and then basically becomes a pimp for him, and makes sells him as a prostitute for other men with pedophilia. And then eventually, like after when the year he is 14 or something, the police catch him, and then he hangs himself. The brother, basically his pimp. And now he goes to the home for like this, basically the state system, but then the counselors rape him. And then so he runs away from the home, and he wants to get to Boston because of reasons in the book. But he's in Montana, and he goes to multiple truck drivers, basically sells himself so that he can get he can get driven somewhere. And then near Philadelphia, he gets sick with STDs. This is around when he's 16, and then comes into contact with this doctor. And this doctor cures him of the STDs, but again, holds him captive in his home where there's like systems of locks there. Systemically rapes him and lets him go at first, and then runs over him with his car. And so that's how he becomes physically disabled. And he meets a counselor after that who is genuinely good for him, but the counselor dies of cancer in like a year or two. And then he moves on to college. And the book begins there. But we learn about all of these throughout the book in random order. So he has plenty of reasons to be like this. He has plenty of reasons to believe that he is the victim. And the book describes vividly what happens after, and it's not pretty either. But what the book eventually ends up demonstrating is that because of his self-harm, because of his tendencies to continuously destroy himself, as he is receiving the love and the celebration of his life from the people around him, it actually draws all the people around him and makes him basically dependent on him. So basically, he goes from being the abused into the abuser, who constantly holds a knife next to his wrist and threatens other people that I can do this whenever I want. And the people around him initially reach out to him because he's a charismatic and enigmatic character, decides, like falls in love with him, whether it be parental kind of love, whether it be a familial kind of love, whether it be a friendship, whether it be romantic. But the more they understand, the more they know him, the more they get to know him, the more they start to see this kind of behavior, and they don't want that, right? Because this person is so precious. But now, the more he gets successful in his self-destruction attempts, the more he does his self-harm, the more he becomes the abuser. And everyone's life just becomes a tornado. He becomes basically the center of a whirlpool that just drags everything with him. And that is basically such a tragic reminder of this fact that when you focus so much on the fact that you are abused, and when you are blind to everything else, it really makes you blind to the fact that you become the exact kind of abuser that you experienced. And this is largely by design of life. Because what's the simplest thing when you get shoved? It's to shove them back. What's the easiest thing to do when you're punched? It's to punch back. What's the easiest thing to do when you are loved? It's to love back. So, what is the easiest thing to do when you are abused? It is to abuse yourself and is to abuse those around you. And this book is a solemn reminder of how easy it is for karma to start its cycle of repetition. Repetition is a very big theme in this book. And it gets more vicious and it becomes harder to stop with every try. So you have to understand that the mechanics of karma starts out with you being unaware. Okay, well, that was really difficult for me to do, believe it or not, but I'm ultimately glad I came across this book. I'm ultimately glad I finished this book. I'm ultimately, again, my recommendation is if you have PTSD, please do not read this book. If you are going to work with people, especially in mental health, especially with trauma, this book is a must read. And it will help you determine whether you want to work with people with trauma or not. And if you are experiencing trauma, you please understand that you have options, and you will probably want to work with someone who has the medical and the state approved licenses to work with trauma, because you may benefit significantly along with the thought work. You may benefit significantly from chemical help, and there's nothing wrong with that, and there's nothing with not using it. But please know that you do have choices available to you. And now when you when you can get to the point where it just becomes something to work with instead of something that completely dominates your life. Like, basically what I'm saying is, if all your waking moment is you can think about is your trauma, that's, I think, you need professional medical help, because that is a brain imbalance. And of course, thought work can help with that. But if you do have the option, I'm saying there's nothing wrong with that. Actually, it can be very beneficial for you if you take both routes. But when it becomes this another thing that's sitting on the back of your mind to deal with, just like taxes, just like thinking about your parents, just like thinking about your future, then I think it will be great to work with a trauma informed thought working life coach or therapist. But in any case, please understand that two waves of certainty. Any kind of life is available for you if it's available for other people. Life is a very universal experience. At the same time, life is a very individual experience. Life is full of paradoxes. I'm inviting you, especially if you are in a lot of trauma, to look at yourself from a paradoxical lens and see all the capabilities that open up in your life when you view your life as a prism of paradoxes. Okay, well, the next reviews will be very light, and I think this will be the heaviest book review I've ever done and will ever do. I hope so, but anyway, on a more cheerful note, I'll see you in the next video.